The names for things get changed, the inclusivity of them gets changed, and some get dropped over time where they say, let's get rid of this one.
There are some incentives that are out there in the autism world that will potentially lead the recipients of the diagnosis wanting to apply that to get extra help and or extra employment and or extra funding to their schools and so forth. So we're seeing expansions across the board.
If you wanted extra time on tests or this or that, it behooves you now to raise your hand and say, I can take it untimed, I guess, or with extra time if I have ADD. Well, that's going to get some people into the category. That's just one example.
The majority of kids or adults, whatever, with autism are not intellectually disabled as of today. So you have your Elon Musks and Dan Aykroyd, but most autism diagnoses are guys, are men, are boys. And this might be a reaction to the way boys are looked at in schools.
Does he actually have no empathy for others? Like, this is what the heart of narcissistic personality disorder was supposed to be. You start with a myth upon a legend upon a this upon a that, because we're building on shifting sands here. We're not on granite. We had people come up with names for things.
There's a concept they want to over-vaccinate things because they have the NCVIA, which is indemnifies pharmaceuticals towards vaccines. So most of the therapeutics, go to vaccines, and then the money kind of circles back into the WHO and the CDC from the pharmaceuticals, and that, lather, rinse, repeat, it causes its own cycle. I'm honored today to have joined me, Dr. Keith Ablow. He is a psychiatrist, an interesting man. He formerly was on the Fox network, uncovering his own actionable insights into the world of medicine and health, exploring innovations, unpacking myths, and so forth. And you'll discover he's an interesting mind. And I am really happy to leverage it and him for the purpose of unraveling autism surge. Which is what I've devoted about a month pretty assiduously to coming at it with what I hope is a null hypothesis. That is, not taking any preconceptions of what is happening and trying to kind of bring a repertorial / medical eye to the problem. And I thought there's no better way to kind of parse this out than Socratically. And our modern day Socrates is with us. So Keith, help me out here. I'm trying to unravel it, and maybe you can help unravel my unraveling.
Well, I like that you unravel things, Dr. Bock. Unraveling Autism's Surge, as the name would imply, the headline, you've done an incredible bit of scholarship here to dig down to find the truth, because, a headline is not the truth, and the headlines tend to read, oh my God, autism is becoming epidemic. It afflicts 1 in 36 kids now, and that is up multifold, incredible percentages, hundreds of percentage points. And people start to say, well, maybe it's microplastics, and maybe it's this, and maybe it's that. 317% since the year 2000. But it's not as simple as that, right? And so I love the fact that, having read your scholarship on this, I'd like you to take us inside it so that those who would see the 317% number would say, but wait, let me be more analytical. Let me play Dr. Bock here a bit and understand, get to the bottom of the surge. What do you see when you put a magnifying glass to the quote unquote 317% surge since the year 2000?
Right. Well, I had an image which I've since taken down. It's based on the Winston Churchill quote. He was talking about the Soviet Union. He said, I think it's a mystery wrapped inside a puzzle, wrapped inside an enigma. And we have a hard enough time, at least, kind of figuring out what a fortune cookie means. And that's only one layer of wrapping, but with an opaque comment off inside, you may find yourself in fruitful times. But with autism, I think the real key is going definitionally. Churchill's approach to the Soviet Union was clouded by the fact that uh, it was a closed society. There was everything was kept from the people themselves. So even if you had reliable Russians or whatever within the populace, they wouldn't necessarily know what's going on. We have a little bit of a better benefit in figuring out what autism is, but only and if we first decide what the term means. Um, and so, again, to use the analogy, the Sovietologists, they've made an ology out of that Kremlinologists. But they had to, look at characters and look at facial readings and whatnot and try to figure things out. We have a little bit better handle with something like autism, but I went to medical school. You went to medical school. It was not really covered when I was there. I graduated in 1981, and that was, I think, the late Paleozoic, technically, maybe the Mesozoic, I forget. But it was not really much a term of art. But at that time, probably during my childhood, there was much more institutionalization of children. And so a lot of problems were kept out of view, and they didn't necessarily have the parsing of the term. So first things first, I went and tried to research what that term autism meant. And oddly enough, it meant something in 1911 when it was coined as a term um, by Bleuler, I believe in Germany, completely 180 different from what it is today. So it was a paraschizophrenic phenomenon. That is to say, there was a situation when people had all these kind of elaborate, illusions, if not delusions, and they couldn't necessarily function well. And they were called autistic because they were in their own world. So there was auto means self, like automobiles, a self-driving vehicle. Um, so autistic meant that. Some in the 1940s, I believe, another German, I believe, Kanner, with a K, um, decided that autism meant something different. It meant something that you were frankly you were devoid of imagination in the sense that you were very almost literal. And a lot of I know some autistic kids now, and I was kind of surprised by my friends pointing out that his son spent hours watching videos of washing machines tumble,
Mm.
and that's what he really loved. And when he came to our house, we had the ceiling fans. He had a remote, and he just had the ceiling fan going one way and then stop and spin the other way. And he did that for hours. I guess it broke the fans all upstairs. Whatever.
Occupational hazard.
Yeah, all in one day. So that's not excessive imagination. That's kind of like glomming onto the very literal and so forth.
It's
So
almost an obsessive focus, not
yeah,
imagination,
and
unless,
right, and
yeah.
it's not as precise a thing as any number of other illnesses. I mean, not albinoism's not an illness, but it's a very obvious thing. You've lost pigment, and you could probably think of other very defined syndromes in medicine. Um, and this is not one of them. Retinoblastoma or something like that is a very specific thing. There's a pathology to it. Autism, if you were to do, God forbid, autopsies, whatever, I'm not sure you could look at the brain of an autistic kid and see anything different from the brain of your Albert Einstein types, whatever, or anybody, or the mailman, or whatever. So I don't.
And you're not going to do a blood test for autism, and you're not going to do cerebrospinal fluid tests for autism. You're going to go to the DSM-5 TR or 6 or whatever it is now,
Yeah, and that's an
and
important thing you
say,
bring up because that's the diagnostic and statistic manual, which sort of tries to bring the sense of pathology to psychiatry. I did a piece of a residency in psychiatry at Mass General Hospital, and they wanted to be more medical than every place else, and that was part of the allure to me. I thought I wanted to do psychiatry, but I didn't want to kind of delve in, just sit on the couch and whatnot. I mean, maybe, you know better than I do about psychiatry, being one a psychiatrist. But the concept with the DSM in general was, and if I'm not mistaken, was to put the kind of labels and guideposts so people can identify something. You can travel out in the countryside. I mean, the first time you do it, it's just their stuff. And then people go thousands of times. They develop maps. They look at landmarks. They call that a knoll. They call that a mountain. They call that a hill. They call that something. I mean, they're all different shapes. And then people start to parse and figure out what those are. I think that's the essential part of autism.
yeah, that's right. And with that as the recipe book sought to define 300 or 300 plus quote disorders, separate them from one another, schizophrenia being different than autism spectrum disorder. Everything is constantly being renamed, by the way. And then, you have the hope of saying, well, if this is a discrete entity to the extent that it is, we can test certain medicines against it. We can, the psychiatrists like it, bill for treating it. We can research other ways of dealing with it, therapies, talk therapy, EMDR, whatever it might be. And so you hope that in breaking the world of, oh, there are mental illness symptoms into 300 or more diagnostic categories, that you can figure out, well, what works for what and how cohesive and true are these entities. But they do keep shifting. And, the names for things get changed, the inclusivity of them gets changed, and some get dropped over time where they say, let's get rid of this one and let's have binge eating disorder. That's if you ate more than you think you should have for a few times in the last couple months to excess and you felt guilty about it. That should be a disorder. And there's a committee that tries to decide these things as opposed to doing tests of cerebrospinal fluid or blood tests or DNA tests. So this is what passes for a diagnostic nomenclature in the world of mental health, as opposed to the world of, to the extent that it applies, the world of, say, oncology or something else.
No, you're absolutely right. And so I made a drawing somewhat to this effect, my spaghetti drawing. And
There you go.
thank you, Chat GPT or LLMs. Um, there's a little bit of a needle in a haystack, or figuring out the right strand of spaghetti. If you had, I don't know, one bad strand of spaghetti, I don't know if spaghetti can spoil, but it was intermixed with a whole bunch of spaghetti, how well and easily could you find it? Would it look different? Would it taste different? So forth. I mean, is it different, tensile structure, whatever. And so, when you're talking about autism, there's a lot of different causes and a lot of different confounding variables. And then on the other side, there's also a lot of different things that have been put into the diagnosis. We have some Italian friends as opposed to Italian American, and when they lived here, kind of on a brief sojourn from Italy, they were shocked and dismayed when at our house, we mixed two kinds of pastas. This is like a total anathema in Italy. And so we had, I don't know, spaghetti and linguine, and they looked, pretty much the same. One's a little flatter, and this was like a horror. Anyway, this is something that may happen in the run-of-the-mill diagnosis or kind of creeping overdiagnosis of what is autism, and we'll get to that a little bit. But in and of itself, it's on the spectrum, so that implies an imprecision. I remember the colors of the visual spectrum. Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. But these things tend to blur into each other, a little bit like the colors. So there's childhood disintegrative disorder, pervasive developmental delay, not otherwise classified. There's a whole bunch of things that there's Asperger's autistic disorder, there's classic autism, there's mild, there's autism with intellectual disability. So what is that? And I try to point out that there are things that can cause problems in the brain. So German measles, rubella, if you are naive to that as a first trimester pregnant woman and catch measles and German measles at that time, you will almost axiomatically 100% of the time get a child with rubella syndrome. And that's a specific set of neurologic issues I'm not going to get into. But the rubella syndrome is clearly identifiable. And the only thing that causes is this. So they have what I call an identity function, a one-to-one relationship between rubella and rubella syndrome. So that thing causes a neurologic issue. With autism,
makes sense, right?
It's again, there's many different strands, and then you have to kind of figure out which one is the abnormal strand, so forth. I think it's, people get better at this. Again, with like the landscape or the geographers or whatever, they get better at figuring out which is a mountain, which is a stream, which is a brook, which is a river. There's all different kinds of ways of classifying things that are very similar to each other. But I think, these days I kind of have a sense of what somebody autistic is. And I have a sense somewhat of what Asperger's is. But this is, so part of the issue is how much of this is semantic epidemic and how much of this is a I guess, a biologic epidemic.
So you're basically saying it, and you're right, of course, but you say it elegantly and comprehensively in your writing on Substack and elsewhere, that we gotta, it would behoove us to know whether what we're doing is imprecision in language or expanding a category and saying, well, we expanded the category, and of course there are 3 times as many people who now fit, versus we've got 3 times as many people in the category. If this were the rubella example, you'd say, whoa, wait a second. Like, there's only one thing that causes this, and we must have more pregnant women being exposed to rubella. Otherwise, this syndrome would not be occurring 300% as much. And that is not the case, according to what you've written, with autism. You can't make that conclusion that, oh, there must be more X exposure or something's happening, because there are clearly 300% as many new cases of a defined, singular, identifiable disorder. You're saying, no, it could be creep of the definition. It could be
Right.
embracing many more people.
Yeah, no, I don't want to. I don't want to get away from the fact that there, can be environmental things going on. I mean,
Sure.
it's tricky for for us sometimes. Not us particularly, the two of us, but for some people to hold two conflicting thoughts together and have them both potentially be true. But it can be that there is a semantic expansion, and there can be an environmental toxin exposure expansion happening simultaneously. And there can be, third parts of it, which is not just the diagnosis changing, but people moving towards something or recognizing it because we're humans. So that I don't want to call it a perverse incentive, but there are some incentives that are out there in the autism world that will potentially lead the recipients of the diagnosis, the parents, for on behalf, they're as proxies for their children, and or the teacher, school committee, school community, wanting to apply that to get extra help and or extra employment and or extra funding to their schools and so forth. So we're seeing expansions across the board. And I spoke with Gil Eyal, professor of sociology at Columbia, the other day, a week ago, and he sees most of this as a good thing, that people are recognizing, even if there's this kind of bleed of the autism spectrum or whatever, that kids, there are going to be some kids who can need help in reading and need extra attention. Fine. I'm a little bit of a conservative financially and whatnot, and you don't have infinite money to spend. I went to medical school in the Paleozoic, and I went to elementary school in the whatever came before that. And at the time in PS 81 in New York City, we had pretty much a teacher for 30 kids. That was it. There were no
Yeah.
aides, and there was no backdrop administration. There was a principal, an assistant principal, a nurse, and a secretary. That was the whole office. And if you look at the masthead on any web page of a public school today, the ancillary staff outnumber the teachers. It's usually
Mm.
60-40. And so we're talking about English as a second language. There's occupational therapists in elementary school, whatever that is, occupational therapy. That's part of the autism training. There's all these aids, and special ed has totally outstripped regular ed. When I was a kid, special ed meant for gifted kids. They wanted, there was the Sputnik era, and there was a competition. They wanted kids to be promoted into STEM, that kind of thing. And so that was special ed. Now, special ed is something completely different, and the money goes someplace else. So that's kind of an issue that has changed the incentive structure. Plus, the parents can get certain types of funding and benefits as well as
Yeah.
extra attention for their kids by being under this autism spectrum or under autism umbrella.
Not
Um,
unlike ADD, right? I mean, attention deficit disorder, if you're, if you wanted extra time on tests or this or that, it behooves you now to raise your hand and say, if I'm going to take the MCAT, the medical college admission tests, I can take it untimed, I guess, or with extra time if I have ADD. Well, that's going to get some people into the category. That's just one example. So what did you find when you do a deep dive? Were you able to achieve a sense of clarity for yourself, or that you could share with others, as to whether we ought to be thinking of this as epidemic and rising with new legitimate cases, or whether you'd say, on balance, I think we just decided to include more people in the category? The question I have is, you've done such erudite scholarship and created a really deep thinking and deep diving piece about how to understand the quote surge of autism. And I was interested as to whether you came down on one side of the fence or the other. Two sides of the fence. One is, oh my God, there's a 309% surge in cases of autism, and we better figure out what it is because, in another X years, it could be 900%. Or whether you would say, on balance, Keith, I think that we put the definition out there in a different way. We created incentives and we identified more cases, but they were always there and maybe weren't labeled as this. Do you have a sense of which it is or what
Yeah.
proportion you could say is probably a real surge?
I think that we are making an expansion of the diagnosis, um, but but others who have studied this more closely, there's the parable of the seven blind men and the elephant, and one thinks an elephant is a tree trunk because he's been rubbing the leg, and the other one, a different part of the elephant, thinks it's a flat like a rug. He's doing the ear, and somebody's at the tusks and thinks elephants are pointy spears. And everyone has a different concept, so it's hard for them. Maybe they get together and they'll come up with a formulation of what an elephant is, or they might come up with a formulation that's completely inverse of what an elephant is because they haven't seen the whole picture well enough. You've got a drone, 3D holographic essence of an elephant. Even then, you might not get the whole elephant nest because there's an internal aspect to the elephant. Plus, the elephant changes over time. So, without getting too, I don't know, Zen parabolic about this or hyperbolic, I'll just put up one quick image here, and this is from a study. When was this from? 2009. I don't like the drawing done here, so I redid it a little bit. But autism expands away from intellectual disability and mental retardation, and so this is the autism. It's like a little bit like a semi-lunar eclipse or whatever. Mental retardation had this number of people in 1992, and say this number in 2005. The autism bubble or this circle got bigger. The autism number, relatively speaking, grew. And I'm going to show you a slightly better interpretation of this. And it incorporates these two images. I took the left one here and the right one here, and I put them into, kind of more visible numbers. Maybe I hope people can see them on the bottom. The yellow
Sure.
is mental retardation autism fraction, which was the majority of autism cases back in 1992. And then there's a bigger number of both. So there's a bigger number of the mental retardation ones in 2005 and of the non-intellectually disabled bunch cohort over here. So now autism is more non-intellectually disabled, but it's important to look at the yellow versus the yellow. So both these things went up. What's categorized as mental retardation population change, I'm not sure it changed this much from relatively 90 to 140, whatever that would be, almost like a 50% rise. I don't think the population rose by 50% in those 23 years, but this did. So maybe it's a different way we categorize mental retardation, or it could be there's something happening that we are seeing a higher fraction of mental retardation kids. So I think this is kind of as close as we're going to get numerically to the answer to that question of both. So the number went from 3210 for the people who are listening and not watching this, from 3210 to 10,000 number of intellectually disabled autistic cases. So that number tripled in this time span. So what's up with that? So there's more intellectually disabled kids, and that went up higher than the number of mental retardation kids in general.
Right.
And so it's like a breath mint and a candy mint. It might be two mints in one, two things going on simultaneously here that are happening. So I think it's undeniable that there's been this massive diagnostic shift, as you can see or listen to me explain about the bigger number of autistic kids in general, and it's moved away from intellectually disabled. So the majority of kids or adults, whatever, with autism are not intellectually disabled as of today. So you have your Elon Musks and Dan Aykroyd and who was the Silence of the Lambs actor,
Anthony Hopkins.
Thank you, and whatnot. But this is a side note. But most of the autism diagnoses are guys, are men, are boys,
Right.
and that breeds a whole another question about whether it could be just the way where not necessarily, toxins in the air per se, but maybe the other kind of, toxic masculinity, as it's called. And this might be a reaction to the way boys are looked at in schools. And so there could be a diagnostic purge, excuse me, a push, maybe a purge also, towards, detoxifying men in order to detoxify them of some of the masculine qualities that can be associated with, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and ASD as well. The kind of the
Well,
mechanistic thinking that guys have, this kind of calculating brain, Rain Man, whatever aspect, numbers, running through their heads, great chess players, computer geeks, gamers, all that kind of stuff. That some of that might have a little bit of a strain of some of these autism spectrum aspects. And then, the inability to sit still and whatnot, that can be interpreted as activity disorder. Now, in a non-school atmosphere, without a preponderance of women as elementary school teachers and expecting the kids to be behaved, and without as many kind of broken households and families with less discipline, I'm kind of making a run-on sentence here, but stuff has changed. There was an old joke from the 60s, whatever, when the atomic bomb was on everyone's mind, people were running under their desks and whatnot. Um, has everything, has any, have things changed since the atomic bomb? So like, well, what hasn't changed? I didn't do the joke right, but basically things change over time. Societies change,
yeah,
and what you're having now may be, instead of a society that, you could look at it a couple different ways. In one of the interesting things that I kind of thought about and then came upon in research was that if you look at Google Trends, just for the simple search terms for autism, in places that speak English and use the word autism, like say Nigeria, you don't see any searches for autism. There's whole parts of the planet that don't look up the word autism or autistic. And so do they not have it? Or is it a part and parcel of a society that has a lot of, say, more menial, labor intensive jobs where the guy who just likes to, kind of look at washing machines go around gets to maybe fix washing machines
yeah,
and or, I don't know, do something that involves sweeping the streets or whatever. And we don't have that. We're expecting our kids, in our kind of leafy suburbs of Boston, and whatnot, to become accountants, attorneys, professors, more accountants, I don't know, intellectual property consultants, whatever, investment. And
yeah.
so we're like, oh my God, my kid is not doing that. He's not social. He's not whatever. So he's got a problem. And in other societies, they're not looking up autism. They're probably not looking up ADD either. Are those worse societies? Well, maybe arguably, yes, they are. They're less wealthy. But it could be that they have their kids and humans integrated, so they're not like picking and parceling them out as having a problem.
Sure. And so, a couple of things. One is, you can uh, look at as many different Venn diagrams as you want, because from inside the walls of psychiatry, if you took 100 people who are called Asperger's, some number of them you could reclassify if you chose to as having ADD and OCD, right? So, obsessive compulsive disorder and ADD and schizoid personality disorder. Right? So you're like, okay, well, I choose those three labels. I'm not going to call this I'm going to unbundle the autism diagnosis and I'm going to put it into three other words. And I would challenge most clinicians to be able to debate on the head of a pin which it is. Like, well, wait, you're watching the fan go around, OCD, you don't have many relationships, etc. You tend to neglect sort of your hygiene, schizoid personality disorder. And you certainly seem to be distractible and hyper focusing because you're so distractible, ADD. Okay, well, that's interesting because if we're talking about an epidemic, a surge in ADD and OCD and schizoid personality disorder, presumably we would have to look at it in a very different way than, oh my God, autism spectrum disorder is rising precipitously. And then you get into these diagnostic categories being expanded, as you're alluding to. And then you get into, well, okay, if we're going to spend a fortune looking at whether it's plastics or it's yellow dye or it's this or it's that, Are we sure that we want to include everyone who's a billionaire and loves to come up with computer systems or rocket ships? Are we sure? Because yeah, it is kind of, you could say it's a little different. He's hiring people to have his children. Okay, it's a little different. And maybe, there are shots of him at various gatherings where you're like, he seems to be staring off into space. Yeah, he's also the richest man on the planet. He's done very well in a lot of regards. So not having a clear view of whether there's an epidemic of a discrete illness unfolding can get you very lost and get you to spend a whole lot of money chasing things that might be mirages. Are we chasing a mirage, Doc?
Well, so it's an interesting point you bring up. First of all, just to address the uh, the mysterious billionaire you're mentioning, that's Elon Musk, and it's not just that he became a billionaire. I like to point out that people he didn't steal the money. People are volunteering. I own a Tesla, and people are volunteering their money, to be on X and get a blue check mark, or they're there for the action or whatever it is, or they want I mean, people want satellites up in the. He's doing things that people want. Unlike some people, Joe Biden, who make $100 million, kind of like on the side, whatever, without producing a product per se. He's produced products that people are buying. So people kind of hate on Bill Gates, but I give him credit for making a Windows operating system that is pretty much the lingua franca around the world, for better or for worse, and it has helped people move up in their quality of life. And ditto Jeff Bezos. I don't like his choice in second wives, whatever, but that's not my problem. But he's producing something where I can just kind of go to my phone, I can get antacid delivered tomorrow, and then a table the next day, whatever. And that's wonderful. So it's a funny thing. My point here about the billionaire Elon Musk is that he may not be able to do visual cues and deal with people on a one-to-one basis, the way we're used to having a beer with people and chatting things out, whatever. But he does understand what people want on some level, and or they've decided they want what he wants. He is aspirational, and he's able to create. Even if he says, Mark Zuckerberg is maybe a little autistic or something, or Asperger's, or he's an odd guy on a one-to-one basis. He seems, not quite human, whatever. I think they have that similar, but
Yeah,
they understood enough about what other people want. Maybe it's not on a one-to-one basis, so you're going on a date and you're saying all the right things at the right times. However, they're able to produce something that's templated, again, like the seven blind men and the elephant. Maybe one person on a one-to-one date can get the sense of we're both feeling the same piece of the elephant. We understand each other. Kumbaya. It's wonderful. We're in love. But somebody else, like Elon or Zuckerberg, might say, you know what, this elephant is a 2.5-ton pachyderm, genus, whatever. He's most close related to the manatee. They share this, whatever. They might have a kind of a computery, impersonal aspect, but that might be interesting to us down the road as we
sure.
learn more. And so their understanding of people may not be on a one-to-one personal basis, but their understanding of people may be in some senses deeper. Now,
Yeah,
that's not going to encompass everybody who's got the diagnosis of autism, and not necessarily the classic autism cases from the 70s and whatnot, which were pretty much, as we emptied out the institutions, of what had been considered at the time mentally retarded. And that's sort of a term not in use anymore. And that was actually the euphemism for, I think, feeble-minded, which was a euphemism for moron, and whatnot. And we had other terms. In 1915, I got an image I'll maybe pop up, but in 1915, they had gradients of, I think, idiot, imbecile, and moron.
mm-hmm.
And so if you were a
Right.
moron, that meant you were better than an imbecile, and ditto better than an idiot, or vice versa. I can't remember the order. My brother used to call me all of those, as well as feeble-minded and mentally retarded, and whatnot. So we've kind of now we have intellectual disability or mentally challenged or special
Yeah,
ed and whatnot. But my only point about this is kind of I veered from your question, is that there are capabilities that somebody who is quasi autistic can have that are somewhat outside the Ken, not the Ken and Barbie, but the Ken and aspect of what we understand as genuine normal interaction. So part of it, I'm not Thomas Saz. I think there are mental illnesses, and I think schizophrenia is a real phenomenon. And I'll get to that kind of the relationship between schizophrenia and potentially autism. and I maybe putting that out as a little Easter egg for you to follow up on.
How unique is this creepy, crawly expansion, apparently, of the Asperger's diagnostic category that muddies the water, clouds our view as to whether there are more and more cases of a discrete, real entity or whether we are herding everyone into the entity's definition? Because it seems to me, from again inside the fortress of psychiatry, if you took narcissistic personality disorder, everybody's boyfriend's getting diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. Like suddenly it's epidemic. You would say, oh my God, tens of millions more cases of narcissistic personality disorder. Well, you know, there are lots of factors that weigh on that. Like right now, uh, a lot of the population doesn't much like guys, right? And I don't know what the Venn diagram would show as to how many therapists are saying that certain males are narcissistic when they're working with their female clients because it's a catch-all. It's a way of saying, oh, he has a big ego, or he didn't take your needs into account. Does he actually have no empathy for others? Does he actually dwell on infinite grandeur and thoughts of infinite power in the world? Like, this is what the heart of narcissistic personality disorder was supposed to be, if that's even a thing, right? So you start with, you know, a myth upon a legend upon a this upon a that, because we're building on shifting sands here. We're not on granite. We had people come up with names for things. They didn't have blood tests, they didn't have CSF levels, they didn't have functional MRI scans to say it's right there. See, it's right there. It's narcissistic personality disorder. You can put your forceps on it.
Mhm.
No. So you're building on these shifting sands, and so is that is that going? Does that mean that we should be very suspect of initiatives that seek to to act upon and spend vast resources on a seeming epidemic of anything in the mental health space? After all, like, they're coming out with paper after paper now saying, well, maybe antidepressants don't work any better than curcumin.
Yeah, no, it's an open question, and I'll have the answer for you in 10 minutes. Um, I'll have a precise answer. Um, so yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm gonna answer the way press secretaries and politicians do by slightly veering off, and I'm gonna show you the male to female ratio amongst children and adults with autism. Basically, the ratio hovers around 3 to 4, whatever. Of this is the predominance of boys to girls with this issue. Now, I put this up because it's kind of a mental teaser. If this is just an across the board vaccine issue,
Yeah.
uh, then more girls should have it than boys. So you could argue this two ways. I mean, the ratio of children, of boys to girls, has gone down in this decade from 2011 to 2022 from about 4 point something to 3 or so. So there are proportionally more girls with the autism or spectrum diagnosis. So that might imply that this is maybe something that's happening, globally. But the fact that it's still more boys than girls, COVID, happened. It's a virus, whatever, or heart disease or Alzheimer's, whatever. There are probably some ratios of men to women getting those things, but it's close to one. I mean, I think there are more men narcotic addicts. There are more male alcoholics. There are more women on benzodiazepines. There are more women with bipolar. So there are some differences between the sexes. But if something is happening and it's like anthrax, it's going to happen to everybody. And if it's coronavirus, it's probably going to happen to everybody. But it seems to me that the autism thing is still predominantly male. Now, the fact that it is kind of changing in ratio could be the diagnostic part, because it's kind of like the educational autism psychological industrial complex, if you will, is vast, and it's getting a lot of funding. There's a lot of research money happening as well in this realm, and those things are just expanding rapidly. Um,
Right.
at base, I mean, I'm just going to put this up again. I apologize for my
Hmm.
listeners, but basically, there are two Gaussian curves that represent behavior in a way, and the female one is tighter and taller and more towards the mean. That is,
Hmm.
women are more like each other. If you had a group of them, they're more like each other socially and mentally and intellectually, whatever, than men are like each other. There's a wider distribution of male behaviors, from the very violent to the very pacific, from the kind of greater intellectual, more kind of geniuses, more whatever the term for the opposite is. And so what you're going to do is capture a larger percentage of people under the curve with diagnoses of excess in the male population than the female. So
Sure.
um, that's I don't know how much that
That
answers
makes
any
sense.
question at all, um, but maybe just pop me another kind of primer
Well,
question.
here's a question to go behind the curtain at the Wizard of Oz's office or studio. Obviously, since you've been a scholar in more than one subject arena, getting to the bottom of things, right, and trying to define what's really happening. Tell me about the intellectual excitement of doing so for you, and where does it come from? It's not everybody who wants to unravel the mysteries of mysteries. You happen to be that person in the methadone and opiate addiction arena, and now in the
Yeah,
Asperger's arena. And so,
yeah,
why is that you, Sir Bock?
that's a good question. Well, I take that as a compliment. I'm not going to dwell on me because
No, let's
I'm
dwell on you. I'm only
all right. Well, I think I'm reasonably intelligent, um, but I kind of I've always liked puzzles and I like teasing at things, and it just seems to me that some things get passed over. Maybe I'm an idealist, but I believe in the scientific method. I think that there are answers out there for a lot of questions. It's just a matter of whether you're looking at things. And I don't like my favorite author when I was a teenager, and the one that really got me started independent reading was Conan Doyle, who's actually a
hmm.
physician, and it was Sherlock Holmes, and the concept of kind of finding things out, and when nothing else fits, whatever remains, however improbable, has to be the truth. It's a matter of kind of finding the path, finding the answer, and maybe that's my own mental illness. I have a brother who's kind of an Irish twin, a little bit older, and we were competitive, and he used to take advantage of me, whatever. And so there's always been a little bit like you have to prove yourself kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and
That makes sense from a
and and
yeah.
I had a personal professional downfall, as it were, or a downturn. In 2014, I was suspended by the medical board in Massachusetts, and I think it was unjust, and it was because I did not see narcotic addiction as a disease. I think it's a problem, and trauma. That's another day, another topic.
Yeah, we
But
should talk
you
about
know,
that.
it's like when you've been kind of defamed or hurt, you have to kind of prove yourself, and you have to yell a little bit louder. So this is not all that, but the thing that kind of got me started on this route as a medical reporter was the Zika.
Yeah.
Microcephaly was disappeared, and I was just shocked that nobody in medicine was writing about it, and that's just an unbelievable phenomenon to me, that no one would be discussing the fact that Zika is real, microcephaly is real. They have nothing to do with each other. And I just think, and COVID sort of, it was before COVID, but COVID sort of reinforced the concept for me that there are power plays, there are powers at play.
hmm
And I have a graph I can maybe put up, which shows kind of the research funding that's gone to autism over these decades. So there's a Garrett Morris on Saturday Night Live used to say, as a baseball player, a Latino, he said, baseball has been very, very good to me, if you can still do
Yeah.
that. And so most of these topics have been very, very good for the researchers, and very, very good for certain groups. I don't want to call them cabals. If I were cynical, I might, but certain groups who profit by that. So in the addiction sphere, I think that the methadonologists and the Suboxonology, the addictionologists, have done very well. I think certain the patients have had it easy because they don't have to detox, but I don't think it's really done society that well. The other example I might give is homelessness. And I actually have a graph for that as well that shows that in the same time autism has gone up, a little bit out of phase, maybe 10 years following whatever, homelessness has gone up. And now we see gender dysphoria. We see these waves of problems that are humans so different, society so different. We had no homelessness. When I was a kid, there was nobody homeless. You could go down to New York City and in the 60s, there was no graffiti. The 70s, there was graffiti, nobody homeless. And then in the 2000s or whatever, there's homeless now. In the 2020s, there was a lot. Now there's a little less. What's up with that? I mean, some of it's lunacy, some of it's schizophrenia, and then it's also how we treat and look at things. And so it's interesting to me with the methadone problem and whatnot is how we approach problems and whether we can do it any better. And so,
Yeah.
the short answer is that, I mean, I have a little bit of urge. I have a little bit of, time is running out. I'm 68 years old, and I want to be able to, use the facilities that I have and the faculties that I have while I still have them. And I think there's been a total dearth and kind of a dropping of the ball by institutional medicine, institutional, professorships and academia across the board. And people are doing what's comfortable for them, and they're acting within their own silos and
Right.
and guilds basically, and they're not doing a genuine service. And since I am really beholden to nobody at this point, I figure, well, if not now, when? If not me, who? And I'll do my little part. I'm not going to be able to slay every dragon, but if I see one in sight, I might.
Yeah, and I think it's important because this is not just a statistical, epidemiological, academic issue. This also relates to millions of parents and their kids in this country and around the world who are told you have this thing, right, with, dire potentially consequences. And for some of them, by your reasoning, you would say, well, let's see how it goes, because you understand the bubble of who gets put in that category is expanding so much. We don't know what that means for your child and whether this would have been a category applied to your child 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so, but the toll is very real because you create strife, and sometimes it's certainly warranted that things are going to be very tough, but in other cases your kid might, you know end up loving physics and working for NASA and marrying someone who you'd say, "Oh, that's kind of an interesting choice," but it's not that they're wholly disabled by any means. And so the interventions start though, right? And then the interventions can have their own resonance and implications. And if we're over diagnosing, like anything, if you're over diagnosing ADD, what's going to happen? You're going to, amphetaminize, and that's not a
Yeah,
word,
well, that's good.
more and more people. You're going to tell people you're disordered when they might be just highly creative. You're gonna, encourage them to sit still in class when
Yeah,
maybe they should pace.
yeah, absolutely. No, I think this is really important. Hopefully, we'll see some of the disintermediation of the schools, and not disintegration, but schools that understand differences. I didn't invent that one, but there are schools in Texas now where AI is kind of giving each kid his own quasi curriculum. This concept that we all kind of are cookie cutter. We all have to need, we're all going to need 4 years of French. We're all going to need, I don't know, certain gradations, whatever. I mean, I think there has to be kind of a throughput aspect, deciding who's going to go where and what your proclivities and interests are. And I think AI and a lot of other things like this are going to help us, figure out what are your likely tendencies. There's, some testing and some kind of other aspects. I mean, you don't want to kind of groove people in, quasi, I don't know, feudal system, which would be futile as well, to say, oh, your kid's going to be a car mechanic, and he's not. You don't want to do that too much. On the other hand, there's going to be some clear evidence of kids who are going to have proclivities and interests one way or another, that are going to be determinative of what they want to do in life. And
Sure.
people, I think you can kind of see the social skills in a 2 or 3 year old. But I want to circle back. I've been criticized as minimizing the potential vaccine or environmental toxin aspect of autism. And I want to I want to just put out the you know the caveat or the warning that there can be some there. I was in
Sure.
Oakland a week ago, and Gertrude Stein famously said there is no there, and she might be right currently about Oakland. But I don't get. I think temporally there has been a massive increase in the number of autism cases, alongside the massive increase in the number of vaccines given. The adjuvants have changed. They were putting in mercury at one point and aluminum now, whatever. There's the concept they want to over vaccinate things because they have the NCVIA, which is indemnifies pharmaceuticals towards vaccines. So most of the therapeutics, go to vaccines, and then the money kind of circles back into the WHO and the CDC from the pharmaceuticals, and that lather, rinse, repeat. It causes its own cycle, and the levels of the adjuvants in the bloodstream can be potentially perilous and parlous and whatnot. So there can be something happening, and I want to kind of touch on, and you might know more about this than I, about schizophrenia and autism, and they're different things. And the thing that kind of keep me on this topic is, well, let's say you have some predisposition towards schizophrenia. I mean, that people think that's somewhat genetic, but it's not 100% genetic. And in my article, I go through these, MZ, DZ studies, the identical twins versus fraternal twins, and the concordance. If something is genuinely genetic, like Down syndrome, and you're identical twins, guess what? You're both Down syndrome. There's no way around it. But if it's schizophrenia and one kid turns out to be schizophrenic, I think the chances are something like 60 to 70% that your identical twin gets that. Okay, so what happened to the other 30%? So it can be genetic-ish. It can
Hmm.
be environmental-ish. And so if I think it's if A then B. There might be some proclivities that certain people will have to become schizophrenic, but then they don't become it. And if they're for identical twins, they're in the same household, presumably have the same doctors around, the same parents and whatnot. So why is it one kid gets it and the other kid doesn't? So there's something that may be triggered by a proclivity. So something can be genetic and environmental. It can be
Yeah.
that that we have some proclivity to getting autism, and then something happened. And the question is, what are those things that happen, and how we can monitor those, and how we can figure those out. And that's kind of, I think, the big question. That's why I've been paying a lot of attention in the article and in general about what happens to make a schizophrenic at age 19 and a half or something like that. He's great. He's great. He's cruising along. His brain's fine, ostensibly for 18 years, got good social skills, no delusions. And all of a sudden, he thinks he's Lord Creator and he's got special powers. And he jumps off the top of a building. I mean, what is up with that? Or he's knifing his mother, thinking she's a dragon. I mean, what's up with that? What happened? And so the real question I think people have in their minds about autism is whether there's this thing that happens, like the 19 and a half year old schizophrenic suddenly becoming that delusional, whether something happens. It's called regression in the autistic cases, whether it's happening postnatally, in this toddler phase or whatever, that people are talking. Is it anecdotal or is it real? And so, I think we're kind of rounding out the hour here, but maybe you can kind of touch on your concept of what brings about schizophrenia. How genetic is it? What are I don't know whether you want to talk about that or not. Um, you tell me.
Well, I mean, the summary statement would be only from my own anecdotal experience of 30 years that as someone who started out at Hopkins, romanced by the biology of psychiatry and still very interested in it, I've never found, and maybe it's because I am a thematic thinker, so maybe I can put a story to anything. But I have to say, in 30 years, I've never found somebody suffering with severe psychiatric symptoms where there's no narrative that can be said to apply a bit of life story, where you'd say, well, I can see how you think there are listening devices in your head because your parent was so intrusive. Now, maybe again, it could be me applying thematic thinking, but 30 years of it, and I've never seen somebody where I'm like, I'm just stumped. I don't understand why there seems to be nothing in terms of psychodynamic loading here. They don't like that at the National Alliance of the Mentally Ill, where they would like to say there's no such thing. It's all biological. Well, no, and no. I'm sure I'm not, and I'm not saying there's no biological loading. I'm saying there is, but there's that plus. And so, you start turning this thing around, as you said with the elephant, and you could say, so parents who bring their kids in, even to say, is my child struggling with Asperger's, could be different than parents who don't bring them in and say, hey, get out and play.
Yeah,
We don't
we don't
know.
know. We don't
So,
know. And
yeah.
Bruno Bettelheim figures into the story. He's got the refrigerator mom, the colorful term for the cold, heartless mom bringing
Mm,
about an autistic kid. And I think that's been discredited. But there are some aspects that might be associated. I was going to put up a graph, but no sense showing it, which shows that literally older parents have higher rates of autistic kids. Is that because they have fewer kids, they're paying more attention to them? Is that because they're both working because that's what they do? You know, is it some genetic thing? They've got fragile DNA or whatever. I don't know, but there are some differences that we can parse out and hopefully get to the narrative close of this. Any final thoughts, questions?
no, I think my final thought would be perhaps reflective of your thinking, which is that, in the end, progress in science and medicine relies on a very clear lens. And getting that clear lens is daunting. And you can sometimes go far astray with a clouded lens.
Well, I like that. That should be the title of my podcast, but it's not. So I want to thank all of you for coming today. That's all for today.